What a great story, eh? The David and Goliath story, and we all know it, although we don't remember all the details. It's got so common in our culture that it's Goliath is actually a noun. It means something big, right? Look at that big cloud. It's a Goliath-sized cloud. Well, that one wasn't so great. In fact, we use the David and Goliath, quite understandable. On the news, you might hear about someone who's gone up against, say, some large corporation, and you'll say, it's like David and Goliath. He's the David, that corporation's the Goliath, right? It's just part of our culture. It's part of our communication. Of course, the simplistic response is that David, the plucky little guy, uses his skills and survives, right? He's the hero. He does the job. But that kind of simplifies it to the point where we miss some of the value of the story. There's some spiritual wisdom in this story for our lives and for our congregation's lives. But let's step back for a minute so you can understand just how big this giant is. So 6 cubits and a span, about 9.5 feet tall, 9.5 to 10 feet tall. Like, there, right? And yes, there's other versions of ancient texts that suggest it was 4 cubits and a span, which would put it at 6.5 feet. But the point is, big, really big. Tim, come stand here for a minute, okay? We have to do it this way. You're the taller guy, okay?
Well, we have to check that out.
Goliath, David. So big. And is his armor, the robe he's wearing to protect himself, made of bronze, weighs, my calculations were on, it was 126 pounds. Ron looked it up, a different source that said it was 96 pounds. The point being, big, heavy. And just the head of his spear is like 15 to 30 pounds. Like, this guy's big. And that's the point. Now, like so many of our other stories, it's one of these pieces of, I don't know if it happened this way or not, but I know it's true. And the truth in this story, the truth we can hold on to, is that David trusts and relies on the promise of God and faces the challenge. And God delivers, and God saves. Sirens going by. So, there you go. That's the whole summary of the message. If you can just hold on to that and get it into your heart, trust in the promises of God, and God will deliver you, then you're good to go. But if you're like me, we need to work into it a bit because, boy, my heart doesn't remember that when we're in the midst of the struggles. So let's step back and think about this for our own lives. What is the Goliath in our lives? What is the scary monster, the challenger for us? What is causing us to cower? Let's first look at it from the perspective of the church, of a congregation. So, what is it? Is it our aging membership? None of us are getting any younger. Is it our tight finances? Is it the huge cultural shift so that people aren't looking to the churches in their community, in their city, to find community? If you just look at the last 15 years or so of social media, then you know that people desperately trying to find relationship and community and connection are using the internet and social media, going online, to the point where they forget that there's someone next door, that there's community right where they're at. And of course, that's not the first thing. We know throughout the history for a long time, for a generation or so, that the church has become less and less the place people turn to find their connections, relationships, and community. So is that our scary monster? The fact that we become less meaningful and significant in our community, in our culture? Or is it that our vision of what could be is limited? Our energy is low. Our buildings are old. And then 16, 17 months of pandemic and having to do this online, waiting to come back. That pandemic just sort of taking us a couple more steps closer to the abyss, to the edge. Our decline towers over us, mocking any efforts we make, mocking our hope. We know we should change and do things differently, but we put on the old armor. We pick up the old sword and hope for some different outcome. Well, when it fails, we run back to the safety. Give us what we did before. What is the story we're telling ourselves here as churches? Are we telling ourselves a story of defeat and failure and decline? Are we so caught up in the fact that we're not what we were in the 1980s, and in the 1980s we weren't what we were in the 1960s? What is the story we tell? Well, here at Trinity, I remember the story being they had 300 children in Sunday school. And that building, that extra piece of building that's over here, was built, and we sometimes still call it the youth building, because it was built for youth and children programming. Filled up top and bottom. When I came, there was all those dividers. If you folks remember, the dividers came out, so you separate out the Sunday school. I remember the same things when I was a kid in the church I grew up in. We had all these dividers. Somebody must have built them and put out the plans because they're everywhere. Big, heavy things on wheels. But when we tell those stories of the way it was, we grieve and lament the loss. And we get stuck trying to think of how can we put on the old armor? How can we, renew those old days when the world's changed? A very small microcosm of that shift of taking off the old armor is the fact that our kids right now are in Sunday school online. Right? So we had to shift during this pandemic. In fact, sometimes it's only when you're being pushed to the edge, that you recognize something truly has to change. Look at the story of David, right? David comes to the army of Israel, right? To Saul's encampment. He hears the challenge. He's probably wondering in his youthful naivety, why aren't someone taking the challenge? Do they not trust in God's promises? His brother, actually, in part of the text we didn't read, his brother actually mocks him and chastises him for just coming out there. You're just a youth. You've come out to see the excitement. We're men here, and we've got a job to do. Go home to your sheep. So David, instead, hears the challenge and says, I'll do it. Saul tries to talk him out of it. You're just a boy. He says, no, I trust in God. I've taken on bears and lions. I can do this. He says, okay, well, God be with you. Here, use my armor. He gets Saul's armor, Saul's sword. The text nicely says that David couldn't walk in it because he wasn't used to it. But what we really know is he couldn't walk to it because he probably couldn't even stand up. Too much weight for this young boy. I don't know, maybe he was like a 15-year-old, 16. So then what does David do? It's very interesting where that goes, and we'll go to there in a moment. Well, let's talk about that a bit. David succeeds because he doesn't play by the old rules. He rejects the armor and decides instead to take what he knows and use it in a new way. You notice when he arrives, they say he sits down, he goes down to the creek, the wadi, and picks up some nice round stones, 5 of them. I don't know what the significance of that number 5 is. I'd love to work on that one. Because he only uses one. He only needs one. Picks up the stones. So he uses what he knows best in a brand new way. And runs towards Goliath. Fearless. And Goliath does his, you're just sending am I a dog? You're just, sending the stick, trying to take me on with sticks. Like, I'm just going to rip this little kid apart. Feed him to the birds. Feed him to the birds. He's not even enough to feed, to the birds. That's all. Right? It's so condescending, patronizing, and insulting. David doesn't respond. There isn't a bunch of back and forth dialogue. David just said, no, I believe in the promises of God, and you're going to die today, and I'm going to feed you and all of your army to the wild animals. And actually, in some of the other part of the text, he says, and I'll cut off your head too. So David runs, slings his rock, hits the forehead, down he goes, and in the story part we didn't read, he then takes Goliath's sword, cuts off his head. This again is part of the stories, in an ongoing story. The greatest insult for a warrior is not only to be killed, but be killed with his own sword, which means he completely lost. He lost his weapon, he lost his power, and he was destroyed. What is your Goliath? Because it's a little more than just what's happening for the churches. Every single one of us have things we're carrying. I think back to my youth, however you want to define youth. Anywhere between 15 and 50 is where I'm put in. So yes, Tim, you're still in your youth. And actually, anybody over 20, I think, no matter how many decades you have, you could look back and say, I wish I'd done that differently. Right? If I made a different choice, if I'd taken a different direction, we all got those, right? And they're like the old armor. Because even though we look back in our lives and say, I wish I did something differently, in the midst of our decisions right now, we still use the same decision-making processes generally and make new mistakes or new limitations, right? So, picking up that old armor isn't the secret. But what is your Goliath? What is the challenge that threatens your well-being? Is it a chronic illness? Is it a new diagnosis of a threatening disease? Is it your disability? Is it tight finances for you? Is it this pandemic and you're feeling weary and isolated? Something that threatens your well-being. Is it huge and scary and challenging? Is it just as simple as a challenge of the busyness of your life? Working and taking care of the kids or the grandkids, driving them around, preparing meals, cleaning the house, trying to get the shopping done, fitting this in between that, right? Piecing it all together. What is the challenge? Takes you on, threatens you. Is your Goliath the challenge of aging and losing capacity, or something else? What do we do in the face of the giant? Here's the amazing part of the story of David, is that he didn't believe in defeat. He didn't believe or expect a failure. He expected to succeed. And he won by using that old tradition he had, the skills he already had, in a new way. He was only prepared as much as he knew how to prepare. And it's not his sling. That's not really the point of the story. It's not David's skill that did this. It's his trust in the promises of God. That he wasn't alone. As he said, God has saved me from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion, and the Lord will save me now against this Philistine. and he charges out with no fear. He acted out a different story. Now, let's think about that. The innovation and creativity that we have for doing something new comes out of what you already know and applying it in a new way. David takes his sling and slays the monster. We can take what we have and what we know and use it in a way to slay our concerns and our monster. If our Goliath is the decline of the church and all the things that I've named around that, and other things you could name, then what is it that we have? So simple like a sling, not complex armor, not picking up the old armor of the way things went. What is it we have that is so powerful that it can defeat the monster? Here's what I think it is. We have beloved community. It's the people of God. We have a theological understanding of what it means to be community. The body of Christ. All members are equal. The members that seem to be the least are actually honored the greatest. From Paul's powerful metaphor about the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians. We have that understanding. And not only that we experience the love of community. If you, say, belong to a bridge club or a social support club in the community, or you're shopping, you go to shopping, you make connections with people. Or perhaps your neighbors, you have some connections, or your strata. Stratas aren't the best place to find friends, but always. But, there's all these different organizations that are loose and tight organizations you belong to and are associated with. Or maybe even just family. And besides family, what other organization has the sense of the obligation of loving the other members? The expectation that people are welcome. The open arms to gather in other folks. The idea that we all belong and have a place. That we're all beloved siblings in the body of the living Christ. Our other connections aren't like that. And sometimes we're so entrenched and embedded into our church community that we forget what a treasure that is. And it's the very thing that people are yearning for. So they buy the new car, the new house, the new clothes, they become a member of the gym, of the club, they do this, they do that, and they're all desperately looking out. They go on to the various online social media things, trying to find community and not even realizing what they're searching for. Here we have this treasure already. It's our simplistic slate. So we need to pick up right from the middle of our context, like David picked up the pebbles, and use them in a means to defeat our giant. So the time's going to come. Let's talk about it. The same thing goes for us personally too, in our lives, in our journey. We are not alone. Every one of us have our struggles, what we're struggling with, and the community, the church, our beloved community is the place where we can find support and hope. And actually discover that the important things in our lives are those beloved relationships. And not how shiny your car is. Or how big your computer is. Or how powerful your microprocessor is in your computer. That's my beliefs. So here's a vision of what it could be. Okay? This is the new story. Coming out of the old story that I would want to tell. Society will come out of this scary challenge of the pandemic and discover that what is most important is community. Neighbors will continue to look out for one another. Every person, every child will be loved. We'll face our failings in history and in confidence move forward as beloved siblings in God's creation. We, in the church, will tell the world that there's another way. That we have the treasure of beloved community. The way of Christ, which values all members of the community equally. that is a body, a living body, the way of love. And when we tell the world that we have this great treasure, the world will come seeking to be healed. And for you too. That's my vision for you too. In your personal challenges from the pandemic or any of your other extra challenges that have come up in your life, you will find healing and hope and loving community and be made whole. David did not rely on the old ways. He cast aside Saul's armor. And he took up what he knew and adapted it for new challenges. And he chose to trust in the promises of God. And although he slung that pebble, it was his trust in God that enabled him to step into the path of the challenge and stand in the light of God. And so can we, and so can you. Amen.
Amen.